So the title of this is "It's True When the White Man Says It," and you'll see on why it's titled this way, because Pastor Price is going to be bringing up some subjects and issues that he basically will be saying this tongue in cheek. So don't take it out of the way, but he's trying to make light of the situations, but you'll see what I mean. All right, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Race, Religion, Racism. This is the racism part of it. Now, as I always want to say, racism is a sin that Satan perpetuates on two fronts: the outward, which is the color of your skin, and the inwards, which is the emotions that fuels blame and hate. And a lot of people today have a false fixation that racism has been abated, that it's gone, that it's kaput, that we no longer need to bring these type of subjects up. But on the contrary, we do, because it realistically has been suppressed in our minds, and social media is a cesspool of truth and hatred. And this is why Pastor Price's lengthy teaching on the subject needs to be heard from now until the end of time, because as long as sin is a tool of Satan, then it's always going to be a necessary topic for us to go into. So here's Pastor Price. Bring this back in here. All right. Okay, let me get started here.
Now, I'm not trying to tell you it's all black. I'm just telling you what the Bible says. Because what you've been telling us was not what the Bible said. Now, it is interesting to note in the description of the Garden of Eden that the names Havilah and Ethiopia, or Cush, are mentioned. Havilah was a son of Cush, who was a son of Ham. Now, the word Cush in Hebrew is the word Ethiopia. If, as has been promulgated, and see, we get to catch the liar right in the middle of his life.
And by the way, I did not know that that Cush means Ethiopia, so that's a good nugget to take in, to digest. I like learning things like that.
Lie. Because it's the liar that said Ham was cursed with black.
Mm-hmm.
Aha, come on. It's the liar that told us that Ham was cursed with black. They said that the slave owners, they said that the black skin is a curse. So Ham was cursed. And his curse was black. So, as has been promulgated down through time, Ham was a black man. Then it follows that so were his children. That tells us that the Garden of Eden was in a land populated by black men. So the Ten Commandments movie is a lie. Pharaoh was not white. I don't care what color he was. I'm not trying to make him anything other than what he was. What I do care about is let's tell it like it is. That's all. I don't want him to be black or green or brown or red. I just want him to be whatever color he was. But don't tell me he was something that he wasn't. That's my point. Because that's just a bold-faced lie. All right, don't get hostile on me. This will help you to understand. All right, now watch this. Question. I just got through saying that tells us that the Garden of Eden was in a land populated by black men. Question. Geographically speaking, where is Ethiopia located? Oh, no, it's not. Isn't it right outside Paris, France? I know. I got it. Ethiopia is right outside of Stockholm, Sweden. Right? It is on the continent of Africa, not Europe. Okay? You're right, it's in Africa. Guess what? Oh, watch this now. One of Ham's sons was Mizraim. And the word Mizraim in the Hebrew language is the word Egypt. Whoop, there it is. Whoop, there it is. See, some of you white folk didn't know that. And some of you black folk didn't know that. And some of you brown folk didn't know that. And some of you red folk didn't know that. And some of you yellow folk didn't know that, but now you know that. Watch it now. One of Ham's sons was Mizraim, and the word Mizraim in the Hebrew is the word Egypt. So if Ham was black, and his son Mizraim was black, and Egypt means Mizraim, then Egypt got to be black. I don't care that it is, but I do care that you tell me that it's something that it's not. That's what I care about.
Right, me too.
And then use that against me to keep me enslaved for almost 400 years. Okay, now I have another question for you. Where, geographically speaking, is Egypt located? Oh, no. I know. No. Egypt is located right outside of Dublin, Ireland. Isn't that right? On the continent of Africa. Oh, stay here. Stay with me, boy. It's going to get good now. It's going to really get good. If that's true, then, Africa, then, and is still today populated by mostly black-skinned people. Africa is not populated by European Caucasoids. Caucasian. They're darker-skinned people. Now I ask again, where did the human race start? Now. I'm an angry black man. So obviously, I would be coloring the water. Naturally, I would be interpreting things from the standpoint of a prejudiced black mind. Obviously, that would be the case. But now, let us find out what Newsweek magazine, which is owned and operated and published by black people. Newsweek magazine. That's a black-owned publication. Newsweek. Dated January 11, 1988. You can go find this out in your library, okay? January 11, 1988. In an article entitled, and I quote, "The Search for Adam and Eve." End of quote. The article says, and I quote, "The scientist Eve, subject of one of the most provocative anthropological theories in a decade, was more likely a dark-haired, black-skinned woman roaming a hot savanna in search of food." End of quote. Oh, you didn't get that? No, you missed that. Quote, Newsweek. That's that black-owned publication. Editor-in-chief are black. The headquarters are located in the ghetto. And they get all their paper for printing from the hood. January 11, 1988, entitled The Search for Adam and Eve. The article says, number one, the scientist Eve, subject of one of the most provocative anthropological theories in a decade, was more likely a dark-haired, black-skinned woman roaming a hot savanna in search of food. That's the end of the quote on that one. Now, in the same article, I quote again, most evidence so far indicates that Eve lived in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, this be the scientists telling us, and of course, all scientists are black. You know, you knew. Oh, I know y'all knew that, didn't you? All anthropologists are black. So this is obviously a stacked deck. All right, moving right along. A quote again. Most evidence so far indicates that Eve lived in sub-Saharan Africa. End of quote for that section. Now, in the same article, quote again, they think our common ancestor must have lived much farther in the past, at least 1 million years ago, because that was when humans first left Africa and began spreading out over the world. End of quote. In the same article, Harvard paleontologist and essayist Stephen Jay Gould, obviously a black man. Forgive me, Mr. Gould. I'm sure you understand how I'm doing this. Okay? Okay? But Harvard, I quote again, Harvard paleontologist and essayist Stephen Jay Gould says, it makes us realize, oh boy, this stuff is so good. Did you remember what we just read in Romans? Anybody remember what we read in Romans 5 and 12 and 5? What did it say we were? All part of the all part of the same thing. Oh, listen to this now. Listen to this. Essayist paleontologist and essayist Stephen Jay Gould says, it makes us realize that all human beings, despite differences in external appearance, are really members of a single entity that's had a very recent origin in one place. There is a kind of biological brotherhood that's much more profound than we ever realized. End of quote. Is that awesome? My God. This man, now I don't know whether he's a Christian or not, but he's not presenting his material from the context of a church pulpit. That's my point. He's doing it as a paleontologist and essayist. And he's talking about a common brotherhood. Sound like the Bible to me. God been trying to tell us this for years, and nobody in the church was listening. They had their own story. All right, moving right along. In a book entitled, and I quote, Sex and Race, Volume 1, copyright by Helga M. Rogers, 9th edition, 1967, on page 50. That's 50. Author and historian J.A. Rogers quotes from a book entitled, and I quote, Key to Culture. Book 3, page 26. This book entitled Key to Culture, Book 3, page 26, Girard, Kansas, 1927, by author Joseph McCabe, who says, quote, primitive man, let us remember, was a colored man, a dusky person. 4,000 years ago, when civilization was already 1,000 or 2,000 years old, white men were just a bunch of semi-savages on the outskirts of the civilized world. If there had been anthropologists in Crete, Egypt, and Babylonia, they would have pronounced the white race obviously inferior and might have discoursed learnedly on the superior germplasm or glands of colored folk. End of quote. In Sex and Race, Volume 1, page 91 and 92. Have you got your seatbelts on? Be sure they're on. Please, put your seatbelts on right now. Cinch it up. This is going to blow up. This is going to blow you away. This is... Okay, in Sex and Race, Volume 1, page 91 and 92, Rogers asked a provocative question. Quote, were the Jews originally Negroes? Now, y'all going to have to protect Pastor. Because I don't want the sword of Gideon trying to find me somewhere. All I'm doing is quoting from a book. It's not me saying this. This is Sex and Race, Volume 1, page 91 and 92. Rogers, who is a historian, asked a provocative question. Were the Jews originally Negroes? And here's why he says it. Watch it. Were the Jews originally Negroes? Only 70 Jews, 70 Jews went to Egypt. But according to the Bible, more than 600,000 men, 20 years old and up, left Egypt, which must have meant an additional 2 or 3 million women and children. Since the Jews were slaves, their women were undoubtedly concubines of the Egyptians, just like black women were concubines of the white slave masters and slave owners. Two black people cannot produce a mulatto. Two black people cannot produce a quadroon. And two black folk cannot produce an octoroon. Take some white in the pot somewhere. And I said this before, and people get upset. Now, don't be upset. I didn't call your name. But these are the terms. And see, all these kind of sticky terms that I use, I don't use these terms. Like house nigga, field nigga, niggers. I don't use those. We never have used those terms in our house. I'm talking like this because that's the kind of stuff that's in print. This is the kind of stuff that's on these programs that we hear and see. This is the kind of stuff that they say in the movies, and this is the way you all talk out there on the street. And so I use the term folk got upset about. I don't mean any harm by this, but this is just true. Where do you think all these yellow Negroes come from? These high yellows, all these, they're still Negroes. You know where they came from? They came from the concubinage of the white slave master. There ain't no way the black slave could go into Masa's house and take Masa's daughter. Ain't no way that was going to work. So Masa had to go out to the slave quarters and take the slave's daughter. And that's where all these strange colors come from. You go into darkest Africa, you ain't going to find no yellow folk like this. You won't find no high yellows there. As such, not as original Africans. Okay? Now pick up on this. This is a marvelous thing that this man is saying to us. And we need to realize this. He says that more than 600,000 men, 20 years and old and up, left Egypt, which must have meant an additional 2 or 3 million women and children. Since the Jews were slaves, their women were undoubtedly concubines of the Egyptians and must have produced mixed offspring. After more than 400 years of slavery, almost every trace of the first 70 Jews must have been lost, together with their culture, sound just like black folk in America. Same thing. Okay? After more than 400 years of slavery, almost every trace of the first 70 Jews must have been lost, together with their culture. Thus, Jewish culture was Egyptian culture. To get an idea of what must have happened to those original 70 Jews, Think of what has happened to Negroes in the United States who came here in hundreds of thousands over a period of centuries, and not all at once as the Jews did in Egypt. In other words, the 70 went to Egypt at one time. But the blacks were not brought in at one time. Were brought in over quite a few hundred years.
Right.
Watch this now. Negroes are so Americanized that were it not for their color, one would forget that they ever came from Africa. Now watch this. The Falashas, or black Jews of Ethiopia, are probably very ancient. They claim lineal descent from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Call themselves Beta Israel, which means the chosen people, and observe the Passover. End of quote. In Sex and Race, Volume 1, page 28, Mr. Rogers says, and I quote, increasingly, it is being said in the most informed scientific circles that the Negro was the ancestor of the human race. Henry Fairfield Osborn, late head of the American Museum of Natural History, who undoubtedly was a black man, head of the American Museum of Natural History, who had himself a strong tinge of white fanaticism, said, Negroid stock is even more ancient than Caucasian or Mongolian man. Henry Fairfield Osborn was a white man. Now, from Man Rises to Parnasius, page 201, Princeton, New Jersey, 1928. Men of the Old Stone Age, quoting, Men of the Old Stone Age, page 262, 278, and 279, 1918. Mr. Rogers goes on to say, Griffith Taylor says, and I quote, a major principle of ecology tells us that the Negrito was therefore the earliest to develop of the 5 races. From environment, and I quote, from environment and race, page 230, London, 1927, environment and nation, on page 87, Chicago, printed in Chicago, 1936. Rogers continues, there were several of these put together. It might sound a little confusing, but you get the tape and you'll be able to go back and get it. Rogers continues, Professor W.K. Gregory, in the illustrated front piece of his book, entitled, and I quote, Our Face from Fish to Man, end of quote, gives the Tasmanian Negro as the first man. Rene Verneau, head of the Paleontological Institute of Paris says, and I quote, recent discoveries seem to indicate that the Negro element preceded the white and the yellow everywhere, end of quote. From, and I quote, Huxley Memorial Lectures for 1924. This stuff, they've been knowing about this stuff. You didn't get none of this in school. They didn't tell the black folk about it, and they didn't tell the white folks about it. 1924. Huxley Memorial Lecture for 1924 on page 20. Rogers is a historian, so he's putting all these different things together. All this is in his book, but he's quoting from other authorities and authors, so that's why I try to keep all this together. Huxley Memorial Lectures for 1924, page 20, Rogers continues, and I quote, Griffith Taylor adds in support that the Negritos, or little Negroes, were the first in Europe. After the Neanderthal, a near-human Negroid type, and that the Negritos introduced their culture all over the world. The original color of primitive man was black. He says, now, in a book entitled, going to another place now, in a book entitled The Greek Historians by Godolphin, copyright 1942, Random House Incorporated, in the book called Herodotus, chapter 104 and 105 on pages 130 and 131. Now, Herodotus was considered the father of history. Now watch this. Quoting Herodotus, who, by the way, lived 500 years before Christ and was called the father of history. Quoting, there can be no doubt that the Colchians are an Egyptian race. Before I heard any mention of the fact from others, I had remarked it myself. This is Herodotus talking. After the thought had struck me, I made inquiries on the subject both in Colchis and in Egypt. And I found that the Colchians had a more distinct recollection of the Egyptians than the Egyptians had of them. Colchis, this is my insertion now. Colchis, by the way, was an ancient province in Asia, east of the Black Sea. Going on to quote Herodotus. Still, the Egyptians said that they believed the Colchians to be descended from the army of Sesostris. My own conjectures were founded first, get this now, first on the fact that they are black-skinned and have woolly hair, which certainly amounts to but little, since several other nations are so too. But I further and more especially on the circumstance that the Colchians, the Egyptians, and the Ethiopians are the only nations who have practiced circumcision from the earliest time. The Phoenicians and the Syrians of Palestine themselves confess that they learnt the custom of the Egyptians. And the Syrians who dwell about the rivers Thermodon and Parthenius, as well as their neighbors, the Macronians, say that they have recently adopted it from the Colchians. Now, these are the only nations who use circumcision, and it is plain that they all imitate herein the Egyptians. With respect to the Ethiopians, indeed, I cannot decide whether they learnt the practice of the Egyptians or the Egyptians of them. It is undoubtedly a very ancient date in Ethiopia, but that the others derived their knowledge of it from Egypt is clear to me, from the fact that the Phoenicians, when they come to have commerce with the Greeks, cease to follow the Egyptians in this custom and allow their children to remain uncircumcised. I will add a further proof of the identity of the Egyptians and the Colchians. These two nations weave their linen in exactly the same way. And there is a way, and this is a way entirely unknown to the rest of the world. They also in their whole mode of life and in their language resemble one another. The Colchian linen is called by the Greeks Sardonian, while that which comes from Egypt is known as Egyptian. In his book entitled, that's the end of quote. In his book entitled From Superman to Man by J.A. Rogers, copyright 1968 by Helga M. Rogers, page 18 and 19, historian J.A. Rogers says, Aristotle, in his Physiognomy, chapter 6, distinctly mentions the Ethiopians as having woolly hair and the Egyptians as being black-skinned. Now, every movie you have seen about Egypt, Pharaoh, dogs and the cats are all white. The only time you see a black is when he's enslaved. All right. Now, Rogers goes on to say, and I quote, Count M.C. de Volney, author of The Ruins of Empire, says, the ancient Egyptians were real Negroes of the same species as the other present natives of Africa. End of quote. De Volney further states in the same work, says Rogers, quoting again, to the race of Negroes, well, watch this now, to the race, now this de Volney was a Frenchman, so he'd be classified as white. Okay, now watch this now. And I'm quoting, to the race of Negroes, the object of our extreme contempt, we owe our arts, sciences, and even the very use of speech. End of quote. They didn't teach us this in school. Only thing they taught us is that we came over on slave ships and picked cotton. That's about it. I mean, really. Overall as a whole. All right, now. Admittedly, the references we have looked at thus far could certainly be classified as past history. So let's bring it closer to our day and time. In an article in the Washington Post, another Negro-owned and operated publication, the Washington Post, copyright 1994. The Washington Post, November 16, 1994, Wednesday, final edition, byline by Boyce Rensberger, Washington Post staff writer. I quote, "The overwhelming conclusion of anthropologists, in short, is that no physical features distinguish any race, not even a combination of traits that will do the job. We all descended from black people. Bye. We walk by faith, not by sight."
So, the conclusion on this is that, yes, what he ended with is we all are descended from the Negro race. And I know some of you may have doubts or questions about that. Hey, that's fine. If you have your doubts and questions, make it known in the comment section. And I like the way he presented his findings. And just like with the title of the lesson is, well, the title of this is, "It's true when the white man says it." And notice how he would say that in opposition of that, he would say, it was written by a black man or said by a black man, because we know when it comes to truth or so-called truths, we've been conditioned to believe that, hey, if a white man says it, then it's true. If a black man says it, it's false. So that's what he was playing on. So he threw some humor in that as well. But, and when he mentions of Jews being black and Eve being black, and this was said by white people, so that in a sense, for some people, for a lot of people, that gives some credence to what's being said. It's not just from a black person's perspective and wanting to say make things up or prove a point, but when it's said by someone of the opposite race or culture, okay, now there's some credence to it. And also I have to throw in, again, I didn't know this about Mizraim, meaning Egypt, and Mizraim being black, so Egypt, black. So I love little nuggets like that. I love learning also. So again, if you didn't get anything out of this, then I don't know what to tell you, because part of this, and my ministry also, part of this is to learn and grow. And sometimes in learning and growing, it's sometimes it's things that we may not want, but that's part of the process. Part of learning and growing is also, well, all of learning and growing is truth. And again, some people don't want to accept truth, but what Pastor Price spoke is true. So, till we meet again, enough said.